Just to end that the session, I would like to ask a question as well.
Sure.
Sir, there is, just to play the devil's advocate here, there is a lot of talk about how he was a British employee and how in his later life he did convert to Unitarian Christianity, if I'm not wrong, and was buried in London. And he also wrote a letter to the Governor General of India about the need to desanskritize a lot of Indian texts. In fact, one of his verbatim mention from the letter is him saying that the Sanskrit system of education would be best to keep this country in darkness. And so the legislature, which have now extended their benevolent cares to this distant land, actuated by a desire to improve its inhabitants. So, there was this very clear inclination he had towards British colonialism being good for Indians and its inhabitants. So in any way, would that have affected the Indianness with which he conceived texts from India?
Well, thank you for the question, but I must point out that the themes you have mentioned through your question do not fall in the purview of today's talk. Perhaps we can have a separate talk and go into specific discussions of the themes that you have raised, each of which are important in their own right. But I must correct two things that you have mentioned. Firstly, he was never converted into Unitarianism, and secondly, he never explicitly gave his support for the proliferation and and the further continuation of the British Empire. And you have to understand that we are talking about a time when the British Empire had not emphasized its territory in India. It was only the East India Company that was doing its administrative work. In fact, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, on the contrary, was the first person to bring out the economic exploits of the British East India Company. He tried to create an estimate of the amount of money that was siphoned off by the British East India Company in the name of trade and commerce. And although his estimates were, off the mark, he had at least made an attempt prior to the more systematic and economically viable attempt by Ramesh Chandra Datta, a very famous economic historian who was trained in England, who tried to at least make an attempt of the estimates of exploit in economic terms, in financial terms, by the British East India Company. And in this regard, I think Raja Ram Mohan Roy's role became important in making a representation of the Indian community and of the Hindu community as well, I must say, in the Parliament in Britain. There was even a talk of making him a member of the House of Commons, and that would have been revolutionary in its own right if that happened ever. But he was not explicitly, he has not, at least to my knowledge, given an explicit endorsement of the rule of the British East India Company or of the British Empire for that matter. What he was, in my opinion, and in a nutshell, again, I have to emphasize the fact that this is a very, very serious discussion, and it requires a separate presentation or talk in its own right. What the Raja was, is a pragmatic person, and he was politically very practical, and he wanted to operate in the political sphere and the political situation in which he found himself, and he wanted to bring out the best for his countrymen through legislation and through representation making. So there I would stop while pointing out the inaccuracies in your observation with regard to his conversion. I do not think that there is an instance which can be cited in support of his conversion to Unitarianism. Of course, he endorsed Unitarianism at a time, and then later on went into disputation with Unitarians as well. And there are specific tracts written by the Raja where he condemns those who have tried to describe him as a Christian. And I think I have also made a mention of his daily practices. When he went to England, he took a Brahmin cook with himself. He took a cow, and he also always wore the Yajñopavita, and those who were present at the time of his death testify to the fact that he uttered the name of Brahma, he did the japa while breathing out his last. So there is no question of conversion. But if you can find out some evidences, I would be most interested to see them to controvert this. And the other fact of his endorsement of the British rule in India, I think he did quite the opposite of it by pointing out the siphoning of Indian money through trade and commerce, mainly done by the British East India Company, by trying to offer, right, by attempting a systematic estimate of the loss that the Indian people are making in monetary terms every year. So I would rest my case there and maybe make an appeal to you to give me a chance to present these points in more elaborate form and taking out more nuances of it in another talk, perhaps.